We're trying a new venue and a new time today, and we'd like to know what you think about it. I've already had some pluses. But, on the other hand, we're not getting the attendance that I had hoped for. That may also be partly due to my lapse in getting a word to the newspaper. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce a man that needs no introduction. Stan Diorsi is going to tell us about the development of telephone services in Lewiston and Auburn. And Stan, he's told me that he's going to cut it off at 2.5 hours. If that's not the case, I will stand up and say, Stan, time.
Thank you, but we've got to get that turned on, I believe, and we'll be off and running. Well, thank you. I'm one that likes this. I like the afternoon, and I like coming out here. It's a little further, but it's not that further. So this should work. Now, that's what you're going to see. I'm going to have words which you don't necessarily have to read because I will be talking a lot, but I will have some pictures too, which you may want to look at. So if you can see it well enough, we're all set. No one's moving, so I'm going to take that as an okay. I grew up here. Well, not here, but in Auburn. And one of my school teachers at Webster had a generator from an old telephone. And he made all kinds of fascinating experiments by cranking the generator and getting some electricity. And we have a camp, or had a camp, my parents, in Monmouth. And they had the old crank telephones. And they were converting them to dial. And I said, boy, I want to go get one of those generators. I think that's neat. So I went to the office in Winthrop, and the guy said, we've thrown those all away. We just took them to the dump. Oh, and that's a common story. When you see some, this is really a history story, not a picture of telephones. But I do have pictures of a few telephones. But it's a common story that they were taken to the dump and just thrown away. Be they candlesticks or wooden wall sets or whatever. But Mount Vernon up by Belgrade, they still had the old crank. So my mother took me up there. I didn't have a driver's license at this time. And for about $5, I got a couple telephones and a candlestick, and I was going to take it apart and take the generator out, and I said, no, this is crazy. And I just loved the phone. And so I had a candlestick hooked up to my bell, which you're not supposed to, but I did. And from then on, it just grew. And the end of the story is, when I went away to college, phones were a little too expensive for me. Yes, I was trying to buy some of the older ones at antique shops or whatever. So I got into history. And I spent many an hour at the State Archives in Augusta going through the Public Utility Commission records for telephone companies. And I have over 400 telephone companies that I have documented and traced and when they operated and where and so forth. So I've subsetted that more or less to Androscoggin County. However, I can't limit everything to just Androscoggin. So there's going to be a lot of Maine stuff in here, but it'll be Lewiston, Auburn, Maine with Androscoggin on the side. What I'm going to start with is the invention, and being in school, you all should know Alexander Graham Bell, 1876 was the invention of the telephone. There's quite a few slides in here. And then we get when the patents expired. That was the big deal because that brought independent companies into it. Anybody could build a telephone. And eventually we got to the dial conversion. I think we're all old enough. Thank you. I hope I don't need it, but thank you. I think we're all old enough that we at least know how to have a rotary dial telephone as opposed to push buttons as opposed
Still do.
to... Still do, okay. Or these things you carry in your pocket. And at the very end, I just have a couple of slides on this. This will go quickly, but I'll talk about the breakup and then the reconsolidation has been taking place, particularly in Maine, and we'll talk a little bit about cell phones. This is my one technical foil. A private line, which I will mention coming up in just a few moments, is where you have two instruments tied together, period, no switchboard. There's no switching that goes on. There's a phone there, and there's a wire between them. And this is how the phone started. Switchboards weren't the first thing, they came later. But this has been used certainly up into the 80s, and I'm sure there's still a number of private lines today where a business needs to connect to a manufacturing plant someplace remote or some other outbuilding, and they can't run a wire across the street because of insurance regulations. So they contract with a telephone company to have a line that's private for them. And so it's still done, but that's how it started. Now down here, we have two terms, exchange and central office. I use them interchangeably as we go through this, but they really are different. The central office is the building where the switchboard is. That's where the switching and the activity actually takes place, be it with an operator or be it mechanically as today. Exchange is the area served. So in Lewiston, Auburn, the central office is on Ash Street across from the post office in Lewiston. But the exchange covers all of Lewiston, Auburn, down to Danville and a few outlying spots. And instead of having these kind of private lines, as you're well aware, the switchboard, if person A wants to talk to person D, they bring up the switchboard, says, give me D, and then they connect them down. And party lines, how many people here, I assume nobody has a party line today, do they? I don't think they even have them available. But you grew up with party lines, I bet. See that? So you know the idea. Now,
8-party.
This is a 8-party. Oh, now that's selective ringing. So you heard
4 on
of the
one
people.
and 4 on the
Yeah.
other. My best friends were on it, and so we did 3-way calling before it was available.
Exactly. This is why the little joke of saying it would take 2.5 hours. If I keep going on all these side tracks, that's where it would get longer. But again, you know the deals on party lines. I won't give a story on that. So now here we go. Alexander Graham Bell, locally in New England, in Boston, on March 10th, 1876, was the memorable date of Mr. Watson, come here, I need you. And that was the official invention of the telephone. And this Mr. Watson is Thomas Watson, who was his helper. He was a somewhat unschooled young fellow that worked in Charles Williams' telegraph manufacturing office. So he had some familiarity with electricity through the telegraph. And he was pretty competent with machinery in terms of building equipment that Bell needed. And these other two people were his backers for money. So Bell taught school. He taught deaf students. And Watson, as I say, had a day job with this manufacturing telegraph instruments. But that was the telephone company as it began. And another sidetrack, these people are all interesting, and we all need to read biographies of each one of these people and what they did. They became instant millionaires, seriously. They hired people to begin organizing companies, and it was a franchise type arrangement. They didn't actually install phones all across the country, but they got agents, and I'm going to talk about the Auburn, Lewiston, Maine agents. But in any case, once that happened and they had a real company and real stock, just like railroads at the time, they were taking off, and it was something to invest in, and these guys became instant millionaires. The one I'll talk about just briefly is Thomas Watson. He retired in 1881. He was the chief engineer of the telephone company, though he was hardly really educated for that type of job, and he retired. He began traveling. He was very interested in Shakespeare, and he performed Shakespeare plays, and he bought a shipyard in Quincy, Mass, and that's what he did with his money. And then he got more money back. Quincy, Mass shipyard became quite prolific in the early part of the 20th century. And the one other guy, Sanders, he sold his stock, invested in gold mines, and lost all his money. And Hubbard is the one I'm saying. Now, Hubbard got very much involved. He was an older gentleman, as was Sanders, with National Geographic Society. His name and his children, grandchildren are all associated with that. Okay, so 1876 we start. The first company was the New England Telephone Company, which was just an agency. This was a company that franchised, they didn't use that term, but that's what it was. They got agents in other parts of New England to start leasing telephones. They wanted to lease because those backers had done some work with shoe companies where some equipment for shoe manufacturing was leased. And they determined they were not going to sell telephones. They were going to lease telephones. And of course, we've lived with that for years since, although independent companies did sell telephones. This quickly outgrew its structure, and the National Bell Telephone Company was created on a national level. And they consolidated around New England, and in the case of Maine, the company, the official name was the National Bell Telephone Company of the state of Maine, and it existed for 3 years there. And then the company that we mostly grew up with, the New England Telephone Company, came into existence in 1883. That was a consolidation of New England companies. There was the Bay State Telephone Company in western Massachusetts, the Boston and Northern Telephone Company in Lawrence Lowell and southern New Hampshire, Granite Telephone Company for the rest of New Hampshire. I'm forgetting one here. Suburban Telephone Company was the area around Boston, and the big one was the Dispatch, so-called, Telephone Company of Boston. And why that one was special is Bell and those people held on to that one. They kept that agency for themselves. So when New England Telephone was put together, it was really consolidating around Boston. And if you ever owned stock in AT&T and actually read the annual reports, there were two companies that were not owned by American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Southern New England and Cincinnati and Suburban. And Cincinnati and Suburban and Southern New England were both companies that started up as agencies, and they did not join in, well, Southern New England, Cincinnati obviously didn't, but Southern New England was supposed to join into this. And the fellow who was pushing it, that worked for Southern New England, died right in the middle of getting all the agreements. And so Southern New England to this day had never joined New England Telegraph Company. Now, getting to Maine. I should have asked this as a question, but I bet nobody knew the answer. Did anybody know that Randall McAllister Coal Company in Portland was the first telephone to be installed in the state of Maine? It was a private line, like I told you at the beginning, between their offices and their wharf for the coal on India Street, or I'm not quite sure which wharf was theirs. But in any case, in July of 1877, remember my first one, 1876, this is pretty quickly thereafter. We have a telephone line installed in Portland. There was one little thing I wanted to tell. When the experiment was going on of how well the phone worked, Bell and Watson, initially they were just in two rooms next to each other. And then eventually they strung a line, actually they borrowed a telegraph line across the Charles River, and they talked from Boston to Cambridge. And all the newspaper was there. This was a publicity thing. And of course, you don't know quite what this telephone is, but the fact that somebody can speak English here and hear it there, I guess I understand that, and it kind of made sense that this was a pretty good invention. But what they did is they got two Chinese gentlemen, and they spoke Chinese from Boston to Cambridge, and the newspaper people were there. Well, now, this is a fabulous invention that can, not only does it speak English, but however that works, it speaks Chinese too. So, but the next one that took place is the Eastern Railroad. Now, the Eastern Railroad went from Boston to Portland, parallel more or less to the Boston Maine Railroad before they ultimately merged. But before they merged in 1876, Bell went down to the railroad office, and Watson went up to North Conway. Now, and they took it was on a Sunday, and they took the telegraph line for the Eastern Railway and tried talking to each other. Bell wasn't happy, didn't think it worked well. Watson It didn't work well, but he thought it worked well enough. The relevance of that to Maine, and to get back to the first line here, for any railroad people, the Eastern Railway went from Boston to South Berwick to Portland, and in South Berwick was where the branch went off that went up to North Conway. So the first telephone conversation in Maine, or through Maine, if you want to think of it that way, took place on December 3 of 1876. But now we got a phone installed. Now I'm going to talk about exchanges here. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. The first exchange in the state of Maine opened on September 1st of 1879, and it was run by Western Union. Now I got to go sidetrack and talk about Western Union. Western Union was obviously the telegraph company, and they had wires strung all over the country. The Union part, by the way, and even the Western, they were an amalgamation of a number of telegraph companies in the Midwest. So they were primarily east of the Mississippi, other than maybe Iowa or Missouri, but they were in that Ohio Valley, Missouri Valley, Mississippi Valley area of the countries where the Western came from, and the Union, of course, were those companies. And they were in the telegraph business. They were not in the telephone business, whatever telephone was. And Hubbard went and tried to sell for $100,000 in 1876 the telephone patent to Western Union. And they said, that's a toy. I guess they didn't know about the Chinese gentleman. And they had no interest in it. But it didn't take long that a lot of Western Union people in the field where the offices were located, they understood what was going on. And they started to lobby to get involved. So Western Union had a manufacturing operation. It was called Western Electric, believe it or not. And the real Western Electric that you remember. And they started making telephones, but they didn't have the patent. And Bell sued them. Now, when I was talking about companies, the people, those four, Bell, Watson, Hubbard, and Saunders, what Bell did after the invention, as I said, they got some people in to run the company. Bell became a professional court. He would go when all the suits were brought to file patent infringement, and there were many of them. You know, everybody came out of the woodworks. You know how it is when somebody does something clever, and you say, boy, why didn't I think of that? Well, all these people said, I thought of that 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or before Bell. And so he was defending his patent for many years afterwards. And anyway, they sued Western Union. And Western Union settled out of court. And their settlement was there were 55 offices, of which Portland was one, that were then transferred to Bell. And the Bell people now have that. That's my. I don't know that this is necessarily the date that they happened across the country, but this is the date it happened in Portland. Western Electric, their manufacturing arm of Western Union, was then transferred to Bell. So that's where that name Western Electric came from. That was the old name when it was owned by Western Union. Interesting. And the last one, which I think is fascinating, AT&T, or National Bell Telephone Company, as it was called at the time, agreed to pay Western Union 20% of their income for the life of the patent. So a 17-year patent. And Western Union, that first year they didn't make much money, but by the time the patent expired, they were getting 20% of all AT&T's income at that time. But, I just got a couple of pictures here. This is a Western Union instrument. I don't own either of these are not mine. I wish I did. This is a glass battery jar. I may mention something about that later. This has one, it looks like a receiver. I mean, what we think of is you hold it up to your ear. Well, it turns out this is the telephone. That's what was invented by Bell, and that's how it was refined by the time it was used. And all this is there's a generator. This is the crank, and there's a generator in here, a coil of wire, and gear, and you just rotate it, and a bell, and there's a coil of wire up there too, and it will ring your bell or your doorbell. And this is the switch that switches over from the bell, when the line, this is where the line would be connected, when a call comes in, the bells ring, this has to be over here. Then when you want to talk, you switch it over here. And now you talk into this, and then you listen, and then you talk, and then you listen.
Ah.
And, because I say, this is the telephone that Bell invented, but in its refined state from afterward. Now, when the patents expired, this is what the patent was on. But there were lots more patents that came up. Watson got a patent for a particular type of bell. And a fellow named Roosevelt, who was the cousin of the President Roosevelt, he invented a gravity hook switch. This is what we grew up with.
Ah.
When you hung up your phone, you put it in the cradle, if it was a handset, and the gravity held that down and pushed those two little buttons down. Well, if you had an old candlestick with the hook on it, you put the phone on the hook, or you put it on the hook and gravity held it down. But the old ones didn't have gravity. I mean, they had gravity, but they didn't, they didn't connect it together here. So patents did continue for a little while in different flavors. Anyway, that's enough on that. That's enough on that. Okay, let's get into Lewiston. The first demonstration took place in 1877, late in the year. So this is just after 1876. I mean, it's a year and a half, if you will, later. Relatively early, but they already had a phone installed in Portland. Now, Frederick Gower. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Doug knows Frederick Gower.
No.
You don't? No? Nobody? Lillian Nordica?
Okay,
Lisbon Falls? Or Livermore Falls?
that name is familiar. I went to Farmington.
That's who
so-
he married.
Okay,
He was the husband of Lillian Nordica from Farmington. Farmington, Livermore, wherever. They didn't get along too well, and they ended up divorcing. The whole, he's interesting to hear about. But in any case, he was one of the early guys that got involved as a job with Bell. What Bell was doing, I told the story about the two Chinese gentlemen. Well, what Bell did early on is he gave lectures, and they would hire a room, an auditorium, whatever, all around New England. And he would go and lecture on the telephone. And in a neighboring room or the basement or someplace, Watson would be set up, and they would talk back and forth. They would sing. Watson would sing, and you could hear him singing out of the little mouthpiece, if you will, of the telephone. And they stopped doing that after a while, and Gower got that job. He wanted to become the person that went around the country giving lectures, but he didn't have the charisma of Bell, and it just didn't, and it went flat very quickly. So he then kind of helped them out, and his long story, he disappeared over the English Channel in a balloon, but he came to Lewiston and put on the first demonstration. And it was in the old DeWitt Hotel, DeWitt House, DeWitt Hotel, where Kitty Corner across from the City Hall in Lewiston. And on the Park Street side were a number of offices. Franklin Company had their office, and the Lewiston Gas Light Company had their office there. So it was a quick demonstration, a short demonstration. Now, everybody must know this guy.
oh yeah.
Doug's nodding his head, so we know Scott Libby. This is not a very good picture the way it came out here. I got that off the internet. It's the only picture I've seen. Is there a better picture of Scott Libby around you?
I know there are better pictures.
Okay. Scott Libby was the Western Union manager. I've already told you the Western Union story. They didn't want anything to do with the telephone, but the people did. He was the manager. This is before he built the mill and got involved with Portland, Lewiston, Interurban, and all that stuff. Though ultimately, that's the same Scott Libby that involved with all those other things. Early on, he requested of Bell the agency for Lewiston, Auburn, and they didn't award it. I mean, it's not that they gave it to somebody else. They just left it in limbo. And then Joseph Stanford requested the agency a little bit later. He worked for the Lewiston Gas Light Company, where they just did that demonstration. And it turns out, it was still almost a year later, they gave the job to Stanford. And I don't know why he was selected per se, but I am sure, I can't prove it, that it was the Western Union influence. That Libby was on the wrong side of the fence, and they were being sued and all, and so that was out. The reason I put this here, this is a telegraph key and a sounder. One of the things that Scott Libby did is, and he was not the only one, they did this in other places. There were 15 people in Lewiston and Auburn that were interconnected with telegraph sets, telegraph keys, just like this one. This is a private kind of thing you would have in your home, believe it or not. If you were so inclined and you knew Morse code and you had that interest. And they would talk to each other over this system of telegraph keys. And of course, that's exactly where you put a telephone in it, and that's what we know as a telephone. Okay, so the first telephone in Lewiston, it was another one of those private lines, and it was, back to that Lewiston Gas Light Company. It connected the office in the Bates, DeWitt Hotel to the gas works down on Lincoln Street. And it was a private line, just ran between those two. A little bit later, Exchange was opened in Lewiston, 62 subscribers. On that same day, this was the second Exchange in Maine. But on that same day, an Exchange opened in Bangor. And I don't know why, I've never been able to find why they both opened on the same day. This was under that National Bell Telephone Company of the state of Maine auspices. And why one wasn't ready ahead of the other, what they were holding up for. But now we're starting to get telephone exchanges is where we're going. This is a private telephone. This is what the Lewiston Gas Light would have done. And again, we only have one instrument. This is a little more refined version of what I showed on the other one. If you notice now, this is a gravity hook switch. This is what Roosevelt invented. And this is a Blake transmitter. Again, I'm going to get sidetracked here, but when Western Union decided to play with telephones, they contracted with Thomas Edison to build them a better telephone that didn't violate Bell's patents. Well, he did do a better one, but he did violate patents. They were written very broadly. And it was, the Western Union transmitter was better than the Bell transmitter. But this is what was developed. That's the transmitter, so you talk into that, and now you listen with this just as we would think you did. So this is still called a telephone, and that's called a transmitter. Though we call it a receiver. But anyway, okay. I'm going to talk about long distance in a bit, but this is when, almost over a year later, before they actually connected the pole, and I'll show you some maps and how that comes in. I don't know if anybody's ever had reason to run into these two people in history. This is the Joseph Stanford I just mentioned that got the agency. He ended up getting the agency for the state of Maine. And he became the manager. He was in Portland, but he started in Lewiston for the state of Maine. And when he moved, he was replaced by, his initials are W.I., but they always called him Dave. This was Dave Noyes. Dave was very popular, very well known in Lewiston and Auburn. And I don't know that, I have never bumped into anything except through the telephone company. You never saw those names for a reason. I'm not surprised, but I'm disappointed. Here we go with the first office in Lewiston. This is the Pillsbury block. This is Lisbon Street. This is Pine Street. Right across the street. This is where the library is expanded to. This is the new library building, if you want to think of it that way. The third floor, I don't know which window, which part of how much they had up there, but it was the third floor, was where the first telephone office in Lewiston was put. This is a picture that was taken in 1889. I have never found a picture from earlier. So I don't know, it's possible that the switchboards earlier did look like these, but they may have had fewer of them, just one switchboard or something here that connected together. This is Dave Noyes in the back. I do not know those ladies' names.
So Stan, that was Callahan Hall?
Callahan
Yeah,
Hall.
up on the third
Up on the
floor.
third floor.
Oh, wait, yes,
Yes.
that's right.
Wow.
Look, that's this
Yeah.
corner here.
Yeah,
I don't know if the switchboard was physically in that corner.
Oh.
I'm not seeing any windows here that I
Right.
can relate to, but it was on the 3rd floor.
Huh.
A couple more local pictures. These are the Lewiston operators up here. This was a lady from Portland. I don't know what the event was. I don't know why they dressed that way, except I suspect that that's reasonably common dress at the time. This lady ended up marrying Dave Noyes, and those were the telephone operators. There's a whole story too about how women became telephone operators. The original telephone operators were boys, maybe teenage boys, but calling them young men is giving them a little extra credit. And they, you know, when you couldn't hear well or you didn't act fast enough, people would complain, and they didn't take the complaints lying down, as they say. And they'd swear back at them or do something, and things didn't work well. So they started to hire women. And the first woman operator in the whole country was a lady named, I forget if it was Nutt or Micknut, I think it was Nutt, N-U-T-T, in Boston. And very quickly, this became a women's profession. This is the newer switchboard that was installed in that same building, same thing, and same 3rd floor in 1890. And it's a little smaller, but in fact it's bigger. It's physically smaller, but now they're able to, you get more wires in a confined space and so forth. Okay, this is 1883 is when the New England Telephone and Telegraph Company was created from the National Bell Telephone and others. But I told you in 1881, Lewiston was connected to Portland. In 1883, these towns, cities, were all connected together, but these weren't. So you could call from Lewiston to Portland or Lewiston to Augusta, but you couldn't call to Waterville. The numbers of how many people, how many telephones there were, how many subscribers there were to the service, so you can kind of see there. Portland was way ahead, but Lewiston and Bangor were not too far behind. At this time, 1883, Waterville could talk to Skowhegan, but Waterville could not talk to Augusta. There were no lines there yet. Bangor connected to Rockville. Now that's another one that's bothered me. That's not that close, and whether that had something to do with steamships or there was a business, the Bangor and Lewiston Railroad didn't go, that wasn't built yet, so it wasn't a real railroad relationship. But in any case, there was a line that went from Bangor to Rockville. Booth Bay was by themselves, and they didn't last long. They didn't have enough subscribers, and this went out of business very quickly. And Calais, there's one more story on Calais, which is, Calais was not connected to anything here, but they actually were connected to St. Stephen's, New Brunswick. And so they're in the record books for making the first international long-distance call. Was from Calais to St. Stephen's. I don't know the year, I can look it up, but I'm not sure. This is the toll lines now. We're getting to 1892. This is just before the patents expired. And I don't know how clear this is to really look at it, but there are lines going down here from Portland, and here's Lewiston and Bath. And you can see now we've connected Waterville and Augusta have finally been connected, although this is 10 years later, it should be. But Bangor is connected Ellsworth, down Rockland, Bar Harbor, but not connected this way. You could not talk from Portland or Lewiston to Bangor. They're not connected yet, even in 1892. Calais is still by itself, and you notice the top of Maine is missing. That's missing because there was no long distance lines, there was no surface. Aroostook was the last place as a large area to get telephone service, and at this point, they didn't have telephone service. Now, I can't say there wasn't a little something under the table that happened in a few places, but they did not have service. This is a telephone directory from 1883 for the National Bell Telephone Company of the state of Maine. I guess the state is out of Maine. It's about this big. It looks like a folded gasoline company road map. It's about that size. Not very thick. It covers, if you could read any of this, but it's Portland, Richmond,
Lewiston.
Augusta, Lewiston, Waterville. Anyway, it's just that the area that you could see connected there. This one, on the other hand, that is a directory from 1893 of the New England Telephone and Telegraph Company. And it covers all of Maine, to which there was phone service, New Hampshire, Vermont was brought in, and Massachusetts. There's still no Rhode Island. That was the Providence Telephone Company. They didn't get involved until 1921 when they merged in. And as I said earlier, Southern New England never did get in. But this is about an inch thick. It's about that. The phone books, you remember those, what I'll call small phone book that we had that were about this size? That's the size of this. These are in my collection. Those aren't, although I do have phones just like those. This is now, things are getting more together, what you think of as an old wooden set with the handset, the speaker. This is where I took that glass battery jar. This is where 2 glass battery jars were kept. The power at this point was supplied by these battery jars. And they're glass because they're filled with liquid. They're filled with an acid. And you spill that, you've got an acid on the carpet or the floor and you cause trouble. But dry cells were about to come, and so this got replaced. But dry cells aren't dry. The first dry cells you took like sawdust and mixed the acid with it, and then you put it in a container. It's a flashlight battery. But you've seen flashlight batteries leak, and they're not dry. We call them dry cells because they weren't liquid. But the acid will break through and you get a messy, gooey thing here. So dry cells are a wet paste. This and this are the exact same telephone. The only difference is this is called compact. They don't have this big mouth arm that comes out. The batteries are separate on the floor someplace. But otherwise, this is mostly this with the transmitter. Now we get a little bigger, and we got the second office. They moved, and they moved into the Cora Temple Shriners building, but it wasn't the one that's there today up across from the hospital. This was on Lisbon Street. They moved in 1896. It was on the second floor. I don't know if that lady or whatever, if it was here. This is between Ash and Pine, and it's on the Bates Mill side of Lisbon Street. There was a fire there about 2005 or whatever, and this building burned and they've ripped it down. And I'm not quite sure if they're building something newer at the parking lot.
They built up, but it built up.
They built up, but that building is no longer
So
there.
that's the Hartley.
Yes, the Hartley lot.
The question, in previous slides, you were talking about Lewiston connected to Portland. And
Yes.
Lewiston connected. Does Lewiston include Auburn?
Good question, and thank you. In all cases, Lewiston includes Auburn.
Okay.
Auburn has never had a public telephone exchange, meaning a switchboard or office. They've always been connected to Lewiston. And Winslow to Augusta, Waterville, and Brewer to Bangor. And you're going to see a few more when I get up and we talk about Lisbon and Durham and Sabattis and Wales and all these things that very common that they would be expanded. But yes, Auburn was always part of Lewiston. And this is a picture of the switchboards in here. This is Dave Lewis again here. As I said, he was a very popular fellow and well known. And it's expanding. They have a bigger place. And now, bingo, the patents expire. And when that expired, now anybody can make a telephone. Didn't have the Roosevelt hook switch for the first year, but the second year they could even do that. And they could set up an exchange, and there were a lot of entrepreneurs that went out there and did it. And one of the very, very, very first foils I didn't talk about was Bell started in the cities. It only made sense. If you're starting a business, you're not going to start it in a town of 100 people that are mostly farmers. You're going to start where there's an industry and a population center. So Bell, while the patents were in effect, they opened up in the towns, I say towns, cities, the bigger places of Maine, the Augustas and Watervilles and Bangors and Lewistons and Portland. Those all became Bell exchanges. And once the patents expired, the only place left for the independents to move was the countryside. and they became often called a farmer's line because it would be strung from one farm to another long distances. And sometimes that would be the whole company. And they, just like you talked about on the party line, they could call each other without going through a switchboard because they had 6 or 8 or 10 or 20 people on one wire. And they would just, by coded ringing, they would, 2 longs and a shot, 2 shots, whatever, and they would talk to each other. Bell, however, now they've got their firm foundation and money. They started to also expand to the rural areas to compete with the other independents that were now starting to compete. And they frequently bought companies, and this caused all kinds of problems, and that's a story I'm not going to go into, called the Kingsbury Agreement. But at one time, Bell was threatened with lawsuits, and they agreed to not buy other telephone companies, except in certain conditions, which happens fairly frequently. But anyway, at this point in time, somebody would set up a telephone company and they'd buy them out. Independent. So we hear a lot, well, in my circles of being interested in telephones, you frequently hear about independent telephone companies. And independent has multiple meanings. The real meaning of independent was independent of the Bell system. It was not connected to the toll lines. They had their own switchboard, their own telephones, their own network. And we'll talk a few of those existed in Maine. Until the 1920s, those existed in Maine. Then there's the independent telephones that I kind of alluded to in the previous one, of these people that set up their own company, but they then sign a licensed agreement with New England Telephone. So they're using Western Electric equipment in most cases. They're using the accounting principles of the Bell system, and they're most certainly using the toll lines of the Bell system. Now again, all of you I know remember when you really didn't make a lot of phone calls, especially a toll call. A toll call was a little complicated to set it up, especially when you were young. Your parents would make a toll call, but you wouldn't make a toll call. But the tolls is where the money was. And so these so-called independents would use, part of their requirement was they would use the toll lines of the Bell system. And then there's what I call the independents in appearance only, and I'm going to talk about these as well. This is where New England Telephone owned greater than 50% of the stock. So it had a different name. It wasn't called New England Telephone Company. It might have been called Maine Telephone Company. I'll show you that example. And there's a lot more of them. Okay, long distance. Connections. New England Telephone owned all the wires between their exchanges, but AT&T owned all the wires between major hubs. They were the interstate company. They were the long distance company is what it was called. But there were independent networks. Now the first independent one in Maine is with the Eastern Telephone Company. Eastern is a very common name. There were 3 Eastern telephone companies in Maine over the years. But this one, it was organized in 1897 after the patents had expired. And it started out between Rockland and Vinyl Haven. And they put a cable in between Rockland and Vinyl Haven. And they became quite successful and popular with telephone service there. But they ended up buying some company up in the Norway area. And they made agreements with other of these independents that were starting out. And they put together a toll network. Now, it only ran from Rockland to Norway and in that general area, but they tried to expand, and they got a charter for the Androscoggin Telephone Company, but it was never built. And that was part of their expanding into the Lewiston, Auburn area, but as I say, it didn't happen. There was a lot of anti-Bell things that went on. You were either, I hate to use this analogy of either a Republican or a Democrat, but you were either a pro-Bell or an anti-Bell. I mean, it was very cut and dry. And it became heated in maybe not to every man on the street, although the Grange, the Grange and the farmers, the Grange took very strong positions on telephone ownership and operation and where lines were put in or not, when they were put in and that type of thing. One of the very strong activities of the Grange. But this company was very anti-Bell because they were independent, didn't use their system. But oops. All of a sudden, in 1902, and they hadn't been around very long, they sold out to New England Telephone. And boy, did this cause a furor. I mean, this is like, again, this is maybe a better analogy with Trump. But if suddenly, who's the guy from Kentucky that had the Senate?
McConnell. No, Mitch McConnell.
Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
If Mitch McConnell announced today that he was becoming a Democrat, that's what happened here on Tuesday. This was where the anti sold out to the other side. Now, and there was also a guy named Cobb. William? No, I'm not following my notes around here anymore, but I think it was William Cobb. He was running for governor in 1904. And this became one of the major points of that governor race. He was a director of this company. And he was one of the guys that was talking anti-Bell, and then he took their money. And you know, in the old days, there was no radio, there was certainly no television. People printed things in newspapers, or they made little pamphlets. And I have a little pamphlet of this explaining Cobb's position because he needed to get that information out, and he won the race. Anyway, when it got bought out by New England Telephone, it was renamed in 1906 the Maine Telephone and Telegraph Company. That's one that makes it look like it's an independent, but in fact, they own more than 50%, but they didn't own 100% of the company. And there were lots of exchanges. This became a quite large company. And initially it was headquartered in Livermore Falls, which is interesting, but it moved very quickly to Rumford, and then finally in 1930. A lot of these, partly owned by New England Telephone, they got merged in that time frame, so that disappeared. But if you had been around in 1920s, this was the big telephone company. A couple more telephone directories from mine. Here's the local directory for the Maine Telephone Telegraph Company. I think that says 1904. I'm not sure. No, 1908, I guess that says. Anyway, 1907. This is now that one I showed you before that I said covered the whole New England company. Now this is the eastern section. This covers the state of Maine. These things are quite common. Again, you go to flea markets and antique shops and bookstores and things that I hunt around in. I probably have 20 of these. Not all the same date, but people seem to save those. And there are a lot of them. Now the telephone instruments that you're more familiar with, these are the ones that those stayed around certainly into the 70s in places. And you can find those in antique shops today quite readily.
Stan, was that the lower one, the candlestick?
Yeah.
Is that what you talked about?
Yeah, that's called the candlestick is the name. It's got a lot of Elliott Ness phone, some people call it. But
I've never heard
candlestick is the, I guess I'll call it a technical term. I'm sure that's. Now we got a second independent network coming up. And I got a lot of words on this. I probably should have broken this up into two, but I didn't. It was called the Northeastern Telephone Company. And what do you think the initials are of the Northeastern Telephone Company? N-E-T. What do you think the initials often are of the New England Telephone Company?
N-E-T.
N-E-T. I don't know if that's coincidence or not, but I find that interesting. It was organized in 1902, and it took over some of the remnants that were left behind, especially of the other independent companies that had been connected to the Eastern Company. And now we're getting dial telephones. This is just what you think of, a rotary dial telephone. This is the beginning. Those were invented, that was the major telephone invention that was not invented by Bell. This was invented by a guy named Strowger, Edmund Strowger, I believe he was from Indiana. He was a funeral director. And he was afraid that he would see a friend pass away and his competitor would have the funeral. And that he's my friend. Why would he go to the Well, of course, when he passed away, he didn't get to choose really where he went. His wife or family would probably choose, and they were not as friendly with this other guy. But he blamed it on his operator. That the operator was taking business away from him and said, get me the funeral director. And it went to the other one. Whether that's true or not, that's the story. However, the operator would say she didn't, but who knows?
That sounds right.
And he invented this system that got refined. And in 1903, November, the first dial, they were called automatics. We didn't call them dial-up. They were all called automatic telephones. It was installed in Portland. And I think the word duplicate occurred on another one, and I didn't focus on that. I'm going to focus on it a little more here. All of these networks had duplicate exchanges. So you would have two competing companies in the same town, and they didn't connect to each other. You had to have two telephones if you wanted to talk to everybody on both networks. So this was such a system. You could not talk to a person on the New England telephone system. Nor could the New England telephone talk to you here. They did have exchanges in Livermore Falls and Lisbon Falls, as getting connected up to what was red left over there. And when I talked about anti-Bell, one of the things was Bell charged too much. They were too expensive. To us today, it doesn't look very expensive from what they did back in those years. But in those years, it was expensive. And these other companies would compete on price. Well, if they compete on price, they don't have as much money. If they don't have as much money, when they have problems, they have fewer options as how to handle that. And 1908, or excuse me, I think it was 1907, the year before that, there was an ice storm. And the ice storm knocked over a lot of power lines. We didn't have cables underground. These were these telephone poles on the side of, we call them telephone poles, but now they carry power lines. There's very few telephone wires in this open wire that they used to have. And they couldn't recover. And they went bankrupt, and there was a receiver's sale. And how many people are going to buy a telephone company, especially a big one that has problems? And the answer is, well, the telephones wouldn't do it. They got them at a cut-rate price, but they bought them and discontinued everything. And that was the end of the story. They get away with it. But, right ahead here, we do have the Lewiston Auburn Telephone Company. And they were the second dial exchange in Maine, organized in 1903 also. And they suffered the same fate with the same storm. They just lasted a little longer until 1910, and they too were bought out. But I have a lot more to say about them. Here are a couple of directories, first of all. This is the Northeastern Telephone Company, automatic, 1908. I think that's probably their last directory. I have these are actually mine. I have a couple older ones than this. And this is the only directory I believe that was ever issued for the Lewiston Auburn Telephone Company, because the Lewiston Auburn Telephone Company is included in this. But once they went out of business, they lasted a couple of years longer. So this is the 1909 directory for the automatic telephones. And those are what they look like. They did ultimately make a smaller phone than this one, but when this were installed, these phones were installed in Lewiston Auburn. And that's the so-called candlestick that was installed in Lewiston Auburn. Now, neither of these are mine, and I have never found one of these in an antique shop to buy, but somebody has one in their basement someplace. And I know somebody that found one in gray one time, but I didn't find it. In any case, if anybody ever knows and runs across one of these, I would love to know about it. And you can see it's a dial. You put your finger in here, you turn it. It's not quite encompassing almost a full circle, but it's a dial. It's a rotary dial. And here's their office. The only picture I have ever found of the Lewiston Auburn Telephone Company. They were on Main Street. Jumping over to this, this is Peck's, and this is Haskell and Seed, and this is Chapel Street. So this is Main Street, Chapel Street, Lisbon Street is coming over here. And these columns, this is what was the First National Bank building. No, that building is still here. This has been ripped down, and it's a parking lot. But they had these big signs: Lewiston Auburn Telephone Company, automatic telephone service. They were on these two floors, and I think insurance on the bottom here. I don't know the person on this other one, but this telephone pole is this telephone pole here, and that picture was taken out of one of these windows. I don't know if there's a better copy. That's a Xerox copy of that picture. I don't own the original. I don't know where it is. I think it disappeared myself. And this is the fellow, Elmer Darcy, that was the manager. He grew up in Auburn, went to Bates College, and when the company folded, he went out to the Midwest and he ran telephone companies up there in Michigan and a couple other places. ultimately passed away, and he's buried in Riverside Cemetery. And this, I also have never found a picture of the insides of the Lewiston Auburn Telephone Company Exchange, but this is the inside of the Portland Exchange, and that's automatic, clickety click clack, and all these things move around. Here's another picture. Secret Service, that was another phrase that you heard all the time. That's what automatic meant. Girlless. That's a drawing for a picture, but that is cool.
That's really.
We talked about duplicate exchanges.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was looking at the clock. Yeah, I've done my hour, but I'm gearing down.
yeah, it's reminding me to drink my water.
This is a couple ads. This is an ad from funeral directors here in Auburn. The automatic telephone, when they give the number, and the New England telephone, when they give the number. So down here, they have both phones. So that was common to see. And you can use this for dating. If you ever find something old and you're not sure what date it relates to, you can tell an awful lot by telephone numbers. And this is a limited period of time, but it's a good hint.
So Stan, was the New England, was that still the switchboard?
The switchboard was still, no, they moved to the third office. I'll show you that in a minute. They,
No, I mean, the automatic is direct dial, the secret one, where
Yes.
you
Yes.
don't have a girl in it.
that's right. But you could only talk in Lewiston and Auburn. You couldn't call
Right.
Portland or.
The New England number on that same advertisement, that did go through a switchboard?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. That. Bell fought it, and as I said, they didn't own the patents on it. And the first exchange, the first dial exchange of the Bell system was Norfolk, Virginia, where they bought the exchange, not in place, but they bought the equipment from Automatic Telephone Company, that was the name of it, and they installed that equipment in Norfolk. And at that point, the patents were expiring, and they started to develop the same system as what was then the dials. There were many automatic systems. I didn't bring pictures that go into that direction. Cushman Shoe Factory, they had a dial system, but it was just for their own system. And the problem with these were they took too many wires, and you couldn't expand it beyond 20. And if you got to 100 phones, you had too many wires, and so they were all too limiting. And the one thing about these systems is they were less limiting. This isn't Androscoggin County, but I wanted to mention that. This is a Franklin Farms Cooperative Telephone Company, an absolutely fascinating company. It was Oxford and Somerset, Kennebec, Farm and City. There were a whole bunch of these cooperative telephone companies. But this is a milk bottle stopper cap that goes in a glass milk bottle. And Farmington, both phones. Again. Farmington was the last company in the state of Maine, actually not company, city. Actually, I guess they're a town, but the last town in the state of Maine to have two telephone systems that didn't interconnect. And there it is. And this is the newest directory I have found. This is 1949. The company had problems, as was typical of a lot of these independents. They sold stock, and there were a lot of stock certificates out there, but they didn't keep track of it well. And when they needed to raise some money, they didn't know who their stockholders were, and they called a meeting, but they had to have 2/3 of the members present. And they didn't know how many members they had, so they went out of business. And that was in 1954. That was in 1954 they closed. I think that's the last directory, but it's possible there was a 52 or something one. That's an awful busy picture, but you can see now 1911 toll lines all over the place. This is a little bit blown up, and I actually wrote down here. I follow these lines. Lewiston was a big telephone exchange location. They had direct lines to Farmington, Augusta, Portland. They had a direct line to Boston. So if you wanted to, you're sitting in your house in Auburn, you wanted to talk to somebody in Boston, you dial long distance and get the Ash Street office. They could connect you right to that telephone in Boston with their own line. They didn't have to go through Portland or Portsmouth or any place else.
Where does Brian Pond fit into this?
I'll get to that and maybe the one or two after this briefly. I'll tell you when that fits in. This is now the third central office on Park Street. This is their building. This is the back of the old post office before the current post office. Same location. And on this side over here is the Lewis and Son Journal building. And this was built in 1903 for expanded switchboards for about nothing to do with automatic. This is still girls or ladies, women at a phone. They added the second floor, which were all offices. The switchboards were all on the first floor. And here's some pictures of the inside of that for the first floor. I believe 27 positions of switchboards. That's a lot of switchboards. But that's for every call. Now I'm starting to get down to the end of this. Industrial, I mentioned. These are the years that a central office was actually put in to these cities, which were then serving others, like Lewiston and Auburn, Livermore Falls and Livermore, Mechanic Falls and Lyman, and so forth. I wanted to mention telephone companies. These are now out of the Bell system. Leeds got telephone service in 1897. Now they might have had a pay station. I haven't talked anything about pay stations. I'm not going to go there either. But it was common to put a pay station on a long distance line. So if you had a line running from Lewiston to
Augusta.
I'm trying to go north, Rumford. You might have had a line into Leeds where they would have a pay station, but they didn't have their own service in everybody's home. And we had a number of different companies that got involved. Green was an interesting one. They started out with the Lewiston and Green Telephone Company, but they got into the Monmouth Telephone Company, and both went bankrupt. And so the Lewiston and Green and Monmouth Company was then formed from the remnants of these. It wasn't a buyout. And that company existed for many, many, many years. Turner had Oxford Company. That's Oxford Tower. They're still in business today. That's one that has lasted. And Poland. This was in Poland Springs, and Ricker was involved with this. They had their own telephone company. Anstar and Kennebec Telephone Company, we mentioned that back here. This was Anstar in 1897. Here's a stock certificate from them. There are lots of these stock certificates out there, not of this company, but of all these independent companies. This is a handwritten line number 1 between Leeds Center and West Leeds. This was stuck in one of those telephone directories that these are all party lines. And it looks like Morse code, and it is. That is the ringing codes, longs and shorts. When you wanted, there were 16 people on here, plus 1 long for central, that would have been the central office. And you could call people on your line, or more specifically, when these other people were called, your phone rang. And now you had to know which one's to answer. And you answered the phone. This is a lady in 1960 in Leeds. It was very common for these independent companies to have one person in their home, and that's what Brian Pond did. The Hathaways and the McAllister, I think it was before them. It was in their home, and they ran the telephone switchboard. Usually, they had very limited service, like an hour or 2 on Sunday, and only emergencies at night. No regular service. This is the Lewiston Green and Monmouth telephone office that was serving Green. It's a 2-position switchboard. I don't know the date of this. I was guessing 1940 by just looking at the equipment. This switchboard, the 2 switchboards, served Green, Leeds, Monmouth, Litchfield, and they were open 24 hours, 7 days a week, and it took 9 operators. This is not in somebody's house. They had their own building in Monmouth Center, and it took 9 people between days, nights, weekends, vacations, substitutes, all that. Just a couple more directories, old directories of independent telephone companies. Lewiston Green and Monmouth is this one. I was going to take more time to talk about this, but I'm going to skip it. Unless somebody knows a lot about the Shiloh, the kingdom in Durham. That's a fascinating.
Yeah.
They had their own telephone company, and and I know nothing about it. Everything I know is right here. This I just copied this out of one of the telephone directories. I'd love to know more about them. I know about the religious part, but I don't know about the telephone part. Now we're getting into more modern phones. You remember these? This is a 1924 Lewis and Auburn directory. And I don't know how many people remember these tell you who's, but this is a telephone directory that's backwards. It's in numerical sequence. This is mostly for the classified, when you read newspapers over the telephone, over the radio. You didn't have a radio. I'm getting ahead of myself. When newspapers were prime, you bought things not out of eBay, but out of the classified ads in the back. And they would often say, I have a room for rent, and leave a telephone number. And you didn't know where it was or who it was. These were very common. You could look up the telephone number and find. These existed into the 70s. This is the oldest one I have. I don't know when the first one was. They had these for Portland, they had them for Augusta, they had them for Waterville. I've never seen them for Bangor, but they must have existed. There's a little bit of story behind this. I have a beautiful picture of this building, and I can't find it. When I pulled this together, I don't know what's happened to it. But this is where the automatic switching was put into place. 1947. This is across from the post office on Ash Street, and they have since added a whole new floor in the back here. It doesn't show in the front, but if you look on the side, there's a whole new floor here. These are the business offices down here. Switchboards are all up.
Have you been in there to just look at the equipment?
I have not been in there in the last 40 years, maybe.
Boy, they've really upgraded a lot. It's what they call
Electronic.
and it's a high capacity.
Yes.
Whatever.
I have one little thing I'll mention on it, but I've still never been into that office anymore.
Stan, was that built specifically
Yes.
for that?
Yes.
Because it almost looks like it's an academic.
Yeah.
It does. That's typical of the telephone company. They were very colonial in some of their structures. Brick is a common building material. They built them to last, and they built them to low maintenance up to a point.
Nice that it's still there.
And it is still used today. That's where you make a telephone call, landline calls. That's where it goes. I talked about mentioning that we had dial exchange automatic early on. The first dial exchange of the modern era was in South Bristol. That's down near Pembroke by the Nash Telephone Company in 1930. And South Berwick down in York County, New England Telephone put theirs in also in 1930. I don't know the month that this happened. The last one was in Rangeley, was the last New England Telephone exchange to be converted to dial. And I'm quite certain it was 1964. If I'm wrong, it was very close. And you mentioned the Bryant Pond. Bryant Pond was the last company in the United States to be converted from a lady at a switchboard for local calls and cranks and the telephones to dial. And Oxford Tel bought them out and converted it. And
There was a lot of opposition to that, too.
oh, there was for historical.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I'm not really showing pictures of my collection equipment, but I have the switchboard that Bryant Pond used in the 40s. And they set it aside and then put in a new switchboard. And I was up there one day looking for equipment, and I go into the garage and there's this switchboard sitting there, and they said, what are you doing with that? He said, nothing. I said, you sell it? I gave him $20. I gave him a $20 bill. I put it in the back of my father's station wagon. Remember we had station wagons before SUVs, and I brought the switchboard home. I still have it.
Wow.
It's only about this big. I mean, it looks big.
Thank goodness we have 2 houses.
I have a wooden phone booth too, a big one that you walk into.
Oh my God.
All right, these are the dates of the dial conversion, and When dial conversions took place, they usually issued a special telephone directory, so there's lots of those telephone directories going around. This is interesting to notice. All of these are the New England telephone companies. The last New England telephone exchange in Androscoggin County was converted in 1949. The first independent, non-New England telephone company exchange in Androscoggin County, the first one was converted in 1954. The last one was Leeds. I'm going to skip that. Here's a couple of little things. Pay stations in 1955 went from a nickel to 10 cents. You know, I don't know if you say it anymore. I've said it before. It's your nickel.
Yeah.
You know, if
Yeah,
you
oh,
want to
yeah.
talk, it's your nickel. Well, in 1955, it was a dime. 1966 is where we got 800 numbers. But you could call toll-free before that. In Maine, it was called Enterprise. In other parts of the country, it's called Zenith. So if you called long distance, you called the operator, and you said, I want Enterprise 123. She knew from Enterprise that that was a call for the toll to be reversed, and it would automatically be accepted. So she would immediately put the call through without asking permission to accept it, and the charges would be billed on the other end. But 800 is when we could dial them ourselves. And when we could dial ourselves was the next year. Here, direct distance dialing came to Lewiston in '67. When that happened, New England Telephone bought the property next to the old EL on School Street. Is that, no, that's not School
No.
Street.
Academy.
Academy. The corner of Academy and Main Street where the old EL is. If you're going up Academy so that the school is on your left, there's a vacant lot on the right that is often used as a parking area. And if you look at the granite curbing, not on the street, but between the sidewalk and the property, there was a nice house there at one time. That was bought by New England Telephone in order to put in the switching equipment for long distance, customer dial, direct distance dialing. But they never did it. Instead, they added another floor to the Ash Street office, and that's where it went in. 911 for the interest there, that began in '79. And this was the other comment you kind of made. The Ash Street building was converted to electronic computer switching, if you will, not mechanical click, 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 in 1982. And this is obsolete now, and that's been replaced. I don't know if anybody's ever seen one of these here. This was a coupon booklet that PEX put out to, if you wanted PEX to pay for your call. I went saw it. I'm really toward the end. I think I got 2 or 3 pages. You could call PEX and buy something, and when they sent you the bill and you paid it, you took one of these coupons and you put it in with the bill, and they would give you credit for the call, so that you were not paying. So again, this is a 800 thing, but this is back in 1910 and 20 time frame.
Oh, wow.
And that's a booklet of coupons, only one I've ever seen. Found in a flea market or something. Now we're back at the end. I just wanted to put this in called a scorecard. In 1982, Bell System was broken up. It actually happened in '84, where in New England we became NYMEX, which was joined with New England Telephone, joined with New York Telephone. In '97, Bell Atlantic, which itself was New Jersey Telephone, the Bell Telephone of Pennsylvania, and the Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone of Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. That all recombined with NYMEX, and we had Bell Atlantic here for a couple of years. Then in 2000, it was renamed Verizon. So that's where the name Verizon comes. Not the name Verizon, but that's how it was applied. That was Bell Atlantic buying out these things. And New England Telephone technically existed until 2006. It was renamed Verizon New England. And that was the corporate history closing on the name New England Telephone. And as we all know, in 2008, they got bought out by Fairpoint in northern New England. And that's when I left them. This is the worst telephone company I ever dealt with. Fairpoint was terrible. And so I'm not with them anymore, and they just got bought out a couple of years ago by Consolidated. And that's the company now that's the remnants here. And cellular, just to do it. The original concept was to have two networks. One was a telephone company network, this one, and one was a non-telephone company network. And you had roaming charges, and you could, depending on what buttons you pushed, you were either on the A system or the B system. And these are the names that were involved. They auctioned off the spectrum, because these are radio frequencies that you have to use. And so there was a thing called the Lewiston Cellular Telephone Company. And that name was basically never known. That was a under the covers private name for the people that won the contract, the spectrum, and they became part of Cellular One. It started in 1988, back to dates, if you want to know, the first cellular in Lewiston, Auburn. And this was the New England portion. And that's what I really wanted here is the ring off. When you had those old crank telephones, they were constantly telling you to be sure you ring off. And I don't think that phrase is used that much, but sometimes they'll say buzz off or, you know. But what this was is the operator is sitting there with a cord stuck in a jack, and she doesn't know when you're done talking. So when you're done talking, you're supposed to give that crank one little twist, and a drop would fall telling her that something's happened on that cord, and she would flip her switch and say, "Are you done or are you finished?" And if she didn't hear anything, she pulled the cord. If she heard something, maybe you wanted a second call. What in fact, people didn't ring off very often, or as often as they should. And so frequently the operator would listen in, just for a brief second, I don't know how long I was on to see if the line was still in use. Because you only had so many cords on the board. And anyway,
Isn't that interesting?
I'm done. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Stan. You mentioned it's your nickel,
Yep,
but then after that you could drop a dime on someone.
that's right.
Remember, drop a dime.
You're younger.
That's true.
So Stan, I'm curious about the whole connection with the Grange. What gave them this power, and what was
Well,
their
farmers didn't have phone service initially because they were too rural.
Yeah.
And it was part of rural electrification of running wires on poles and the expense.
The Grange also advocated for rural free delivery.
Yes.
The Grange was behind that.
And railroad rates.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The Grange was actually formed in many areas to create a cooperative to give the farmers an edge against the railroad's freight rates.
Fires.
Wow.
If your hay in the barn caught on fire,
Yeah.
you wanted somebody to come.
Yeah.
And you'd like a telephone to call somebody.
Sure.
And then doctors, and it just goes on
Sure.
to those practical uses
The-
as opposed
the-
to cosmetic
the-
usage.
The Grange was originally very much a political action.
Yeah.
Who-
Sounds that way. A union of sorts, really. Farmers.
Yeah.
union.
Join together.
Yeah.
I was always
In terms
afraid.
of- Wow.
Well, thank you very much, Stan.
I hope you learned